All right. Hey, everybody. It is the end of the semester, and with that brings conversations about how we're going to transfer these communication skills that we've been learning all semester to the real world and putting them into practice in applied settings. And I thought, what better way to do that than to bring somebody in to have a conversation with us that has done exactly that. And that is my good friend and colleague, Mr. Steve Lanzit. Steve's an alumni of the program. So, Steve, thanks for taking a few minutes to come on and have this interview. If you wouldn't mind, you want to just share a little background about your story?
Absolutely. First and foremost, good to see you, Rory. Thanks so much for having me here. To give the group a little bit of insight about my backstory and upbringing here. So I grew up in Chaplin, Connecticut, which if you've never heard of before, I don't fault you. It's a small town outside of Stores, about 20 minutes outside of Stores. So I grew up in that area, born and raised, and ventured, not too far down the road to start my college career at UConn. So I'm UConn through and through, go Huskies here. Early on, I gravitated towards the communication department. I found it was something that not only interests me, but I figured I didn't know what I wanted to do upon graduation, probably like many of you, but I figured it was probably a skill that I could apply to, let's face it, just about anything. So I graduated from UConn in 2009 with a degree in communication. And shortly thereafter, I jumped right into the workforce. So I work for a private company today called Check Writers. You can see the emblem here in the payroll and human resource space. I started my career at a very large corporate payroll and HR provider in ADP. Some of you may have either have heard of ADP or probably at some point gotten a paycheck from ADP. So I put in nearly a decade of service at ADP, 8.5 years, before I made the transition over to Check Writers. I was in various sales and management capacities and really got my foundation there. And in the last few years here, I've transitioned over to the private realm, and I work for Check Writers in a sales capacity now.
Awesome, Steve. So, we've had great fortune of being friends thanks to UConn, and we've had so many great conversations over the years. And we talk a lot about communication and just how valuable it is to everything that we do, to our relationships, to our careers. So let's talk a little bit. I want to go back in the time machine for a moment. And you took public speaking with us right a long time ago. And the foundations of that course are going to be the foundations for our conversation today. So for everybody watching, I want you to be thinking to yourself, what have we done this semester? Well, first and foremost, the very first thing we did this semester was we talked about audience analysis. And then from there, we talked about organizing our content, making sure that we had a great structure for the presentation that we were going to give. And then we talked about delivery, right? We talked about dynamism, both vocal and nonverbal. We then talked about the role and importance of integrating all that great feedback that you've been getting from your discussion instructors all semester. And then finally, the course ended with the persuasive speech. And we're going to end our conversation today with a question for Steve about how he has been so successfully persuasive in his sales career over the last 15 years or so. So let's dive right in, Steve. First question for you is, talk to us a little bit about the importance of audience analysis and what it means to you on a day-to-day basis for what you do now.
Yeah, I mean, audience analysis, especially in the environment we're in, where, let's face it, all of my meetings are virtual at this point. Before the pandemic, I'd be lucky enough to go see people face to face, but not so much anymore, right? I think it really starts with the homework portion of it. And I'll have to apologize in advance. One of the perks of working from home is more time spent with our fur babies here, but I apologize if you can hear my dog barking at the mailman in the background, Rory. But really what I'm alluding to when I say homework is, if my audience now that I'm meeting virtually and I never get the chance to actually meet face to face, I need to have such a great first impression. And I think in order for me to do that, part of that needs to know what their background is. Where do they go to school? How long have they been in their line of work? What does their circle look like? So I'll do a lot of research on LinkedIn, for example. I'll go to Facebook. I'll see what they did this past weekend. If I can somehow tie that in and reference it into my conversation that I have with them on a Monday, I just have a leg up at that point. So I think for me to really be able to analyze the audience in which I'm about to meet with, and dig in and do my homework is really important. And in an industry that's as competitive as mine, and many of you are probably going to venture into similar industries where it's very, very competitive, I think having an understanding of who I'm meeting with, what their goals are, what their backstory is, gives me a leg up on my competition, quite frankly.
Yeah, you know what? Two things stand out to me there. I think one, it's a lot easier to be likable if people feel like they can relate to you. And the easiest way to relate to somebody is to talk about something that they're interested in. And then the second piece of it is, you know, a great piece of business advice that kind of floats around there. So we won't attribute it to any one person in particular, but you can do great business if you can help people. And
Right.
I think if you have a sense of maybe where they're struggling, you get a chance to help them. But if you don't do your homework, if you don't do your research, right? Like you were talking about actually digging into social media, like there's little things I think that you can infer from the way that they're posting, from the things that they're not posting, even in regards to just saying like, hey, look, like it seems like you haven't really been talking a lot about a success in the human resources area. Have you been doing a lot of training and development this year? No, why not? Right? This is a great opportunity. Everybody's at home, invest in them. So those little things can go a long way. All right. So our next question, and this is a tough one, I think, for folks when they're a student. So for our students watching right now, we do a lot of work on making sure that you have structure, that you go through a best practices approach to your speech. For you, Steve, you actually have, you know, this kind of opportunity where you do a lot of pitching, right? You know, you'll probably call them conversations, but you're presenting your product in the best light possible. And I would imagine, and I want you to talk a little bit about like, do you think about strategically like where your points are going to go, or like what you're going to lead with, what you're going to close with, like where you put, if you've got a weakness in the presentation, maybe it's price or maybe it's service, whatever it is, like, do you think about like, all right, like I know that they're going to have a problem with that, so like let me put that up front or let me put that at the back. Like tell me a little bit about how you organize, you know, your pitches on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my case, preparation is king, right? I'm a huge Patriots and Bill Belichick fan, and there's nobody better in the business that prepares like Bill Belichick, right? And I try and translate that into my professional life. I don't want to be caught off guard. I want to have everything calculated. And I want to have thought that conversation through a million times before I actually have it. So yes, I think in a position like mine where I'm presenting to people, I'll know what our strengths, our weaknesses are. I'll know what some of their strengths, their weaknesses are, and I'll be able to really, I like personally to really drill down into it. I like to type out my pitch before I do it. Now I'm at a point now in my career where I've probably done that pitch maybe close to a million times, right? So I have a pretty good understanding of how it can change subtly from a meeting to meeting. But if there's anything new that I'm about to introduce or try or something different about a certain group, I type it out, I read it, I memorize it, I try it. Maybe I'll ask you one of these days, Roy, to be my, mirror, if you will, so I can try it on you. So I really like to go into every conversation with a prepared mindset, knowing exactly where everything needs to fall into line for me to be successful.
You know, I think the takeaway for our students there in your answer, Steve, is that we've been training them to have at least 2 or 3 approaches for each of the 4 speeches, and they have to select one and they've got to utilize one. What you just said was great, because when you transition to those proverbial real world settings, like anything could happen.
Yep.
And by having a few templates, by having a few structures, by having kind of this approach, and that's what we've been trying to teach them, you know, like, okay, if this happens, because a lot of times for me, right, even going into certain consults, like somebody doesn't show up and you're
Right.
thinking, oh, I've prepared the whole thing, because that person being in the room changes the dynamic of the decision making. And if you don't have a secondary template, or you haven't gone through, as you said, I thought that was really interesting. You said, I've gone through it a million times in my head. This is what being a professional communicator is about. It's thinking about every possible thing: who's there, who's not there, and what time of day it is, and you know, whether or not they've eaten breakfast. Like all of it is part of that conversation. So be prepared, but stay nimble. And that's, I think, you know, what we're talking about.
Totally.
Okay, my third point was during the course of the public speaking semester, and you know, you would have been exceptional at this early days, and you still are. You've got a great delivery, and I think that's probably one of the things that separates you from your competition. I think it probably comes down to self-awareness, but I won't put words in your mouth. What do you think your delivery does to help you communicate effectively in regards to your verbal and nonverbal exchanges?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest takeaways too, to take a step back, that when I look back on my career in the communication department at UConn, was it gave me the ability to really understand how to read an audience. And I think that goes hand in hand with my delivery, because I know, again, this boils down to homework. I know who my audience is going to be. So I can really then, at that point, I'm almost like a chameleon, right? Not fake by any means, but I have the ability to adjust depending on who my audience is, whether it's a younger demographic, an older demographic. so on and so forth. So from my standpoint, to your point, Roy, I think having the self-awareness to realize, okay, I maybe need to tone it down a little bit with group or bring it up a notch, is so important. And yes, your delivery, in my opinion, changes depending on who your audience is. So to have that in your bag, and again, that's something that I learned at UConn in the communication department, to have that in your bag and to be able to change on the fly like that, depending on who your audience is, it is so important in my opinion.
There's something really cool about that answer, because I asked you thinking about, kind of a singular delivery, like your delivery style. And what you spoke back to us was spot on, because it's like, as soon as your audience changes, your delivery needs to change. And I think one of the things that we can get stuck on early in our careers, especially if you find some relative success, right, is like, I think in any sports analogy, you do something, you go, wait, what happened there? I want to do that again. And it's interesting because when it comes to communication, though, right, there's never, just like that shot in golf, like it's never going to be exactly the same. And so you actually do need to stay nimble, to your point, and say like, okay, that worked there, but I can't just be that character, because that character is not going to work in the next room over. So it's about the self-awareness piece, which actually leads us into our fourth point. You've done some lectures in the past, and if we were not in a pandemic, you and I'd probably be going out for lunch later on this afternoon on a Friday, and getting a chance to go and spend some time together. Talk to me a little bit about what feedback means, especially in a sales career, right? So sales brings with it a particular connotation. People think it's hard, it's challenging, it can be ruthless at times. And you've done something that's been so impressive to me, is I think that you take all of your feedback in stride. You always have great perspective on it. What works for you? Like, why are you so capable? Why are you so comfortable with feedback, when we know, and certainly some of the students watching, like, one of the hardest parts of this course is that you're getting feedback unlike probably any other class you're going to take at UConn, right? There's going to be somebody who's going, hey, this wasn't great, or like, you got to work on this, or you're doing this thing. And I always talk to them about, hey, let's not fight this feedback. Like, let's just take it in stride. Even if you don't agree with it, right? It's still feedback. Why have you been so comfortable at taking feedback?
I live almost by a mantra where I don't necessarily want to be right. I want to get it right. And in order to do that and achieve that, I've come to realize that feedback's a gift, right? It's not the enemy, good or bad. Feedback is a gift. And I think, for me, I just want to be the best I can. And you know how competitive I am, almost to a fault sometimes. But even in my line of work, in my industry, I want to be regarded as the best. And I know in order to accomplish that, I need to take feedback in stride, and I need to understand that, hey, here's an area that I can get better at. And if somebody can provide me some feedback, I'm all ears. I'm going to listen, right? I think we love to hear positive feedback. Who doesn't, right? They love to be patted on the back here. But I think the constructive criticism and feedback is equally, if not more important than the good feedback, because then you get an understanding of your weaknesses. And when your weaknesses become strengths, that's really kind of where the magic happens, right? And that's when you become better at anything you're looking to do, whether that's an athlete, a sales professional like myself, or anything that any of your students are looking to venture into, once they leave UConn.
So let's kind of talk about the fifth and final phase of this, which is persuasion. And the course ends with persuasive speech. It always has for a long time. I've been doing the course for a long time. And why is that? Because for me personally, and I think you'd agree, it is the ultimate culmination of putting all these things together, right? It's doing your homework. It's a great delivery. It's being nimble. And persuasion sometimes, right, out in the open world, it kind of comes off as a dirty word, right? Like, I'm going to persuade you. And people go, oh, right? Like, but if we really think about the art and science of what we're talking about, and what you and I are passionate about, which is communication, to me, I regard almost all communication as being persuasive, right? It has purpose. I'm interested in hearing your perspective. How has your understanding of being persuasive or being persuaded, how has that evolved and changed for you? Like, how is that different from you when you were, 19 and 20, in college, and somebody would say like, hey, I'm going to persuade you, to now where you're at in your career, successfully having persuaded some people, unsuccessfully not persuading some people right along the way. What's changed for you as you think about that concept, and how it's become different for you over time?
Sure. So, well, it's funny because I can remember the days of our persuasion class, and it was more so used almost as a tactic at that point, right? We had to accomplish a goal, and the goal was to pass the course and learn something along the way. But now, as I've spent more time in a professional atmosphere, My view of persuasion is, how do I provide as much value to somebody as I can? How do they give them insight to the value that me personally I can provide, what my company can provide? So I don't look at persuasion as a dirty word whatsoever. I think it's allowing people insight, almost opening the floodgates to see what type of value you can provide to them, to their organization, whatever it may be, to their family. So I think sometimes there's a barrier there, right? And people need to be, quote unquote, persuaded in order to see what the true value is there. And I've learned the strategy around that and the importance of that. I mean, let's face it, for a lot of you, you're probably going to be venturing into the workplace and you need to persuade people to hire you. I think, there's a barrier there where maybe somebody wants to hire you, but they need to be persuaded as to what value you're going to bring their organization. So I think it's really up to all of us to be, fine tune those skills and not look at persuasion as a negative thing, rather a positive one, in which again allows people to really see provide insight in terms of what value you can bring.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love this concept that you were talking about where you said being open-minded to persuasion, not just its concept, but actually being open-minded to you being persuaded. Because I think one of the things that it does, right, we know that like if our anxieties are high and our defense mechanisms are up, it's hard to receive. So if you want to become better at persuasion, well, be more open to listening to others, because now you can start to use their tactics. And I think those of us who enjoy communication, we seek role models consistently. We're always kind of pulling pieces from people who are doing it well. And that's so true. Like, that's such a great way to think about communication and persuasion, saying, well, let other people try to persuade you. And then if it works, go, why did that
Right.
work? And how could I take that little piece with us? Uh,
Exactly.
Steve, pleasure as always. Thanks for coming on and sharing some insights. For any of the students that are watching, Steve Lanzit is on LinkedIn, and he would be happy to connect with you, and he shares his stories and the different things that he's working on. We want to wish everybody who's watching a really kind of safe end of semester. Steve, I want to wish you and your family all the health and safety heading into the holiday season here, and we will chat and talk again soon.
You as well, Rory. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You're more than welcome. See you. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Take care.